Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now then, the Bank of England has warned that the outlook for Britain's financial stability remains challenging in the wake of the Brexit vote, and the Governor, Mark Carney, has told this programme that the election of Donald Trump as US President could accelerate the slowdown in global trade. The warnings come as the mostly publicly owned Royal Bank of Scotland failed the bank's annual stress test. Our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy, has the story.
RBS, the bank that crumbled and had to be bailed out by you and me. It likes to tell us the past is behind it. It's being rebuilt, a new bank with a different outlook. But apply some pressure and you see just how much heavy lifting still needs to be done. And that was the point of the Bank of England's latest stress tests, to see which banks could withstand a future global economic storm. No prizes for guessing who failed. RBS's financial position 8 years on, still too weak to cope.
The management haven't addressed the culture at the top of the organisation. You know, it's business as usual rather than sorting out their deep-rooted problems. And that differentiates them from other banks who've got on and started to sort things out.
Barclays and Standard Chartered also failed key elements of the tests, only they had plans in place to build their defences, while RBS is still deciding how to plug its £2 billion hole.
While it's true the Bank of England's stress tests were very severe, modelling both a global recession and UK house prices falling off a cliff, RBS was vulnerable because of the billions of pounds worth of fines it still has to pay to make good past bad behaviour. And that's not its only worry. The Bank of England also highlighted numerous potential threats that could further strain both RBS and Britain's financial system.
The bank's fretting over debt levels, with Britain's credit card borrowing growing at its fastest rate in 11 years. China's got a debt problem too, with growth increasingly reliant upon credit. Britain's enormous trade deficit could worsen if foreign investors lose their appetite for all things UK. And then there's Europe, looming elections, high government debt and fragile banks, especially in Italy.
And speaking of Europe, the biggest uncertainty is, of course, Brexit. Mark Carney today warning that Britain is effectively the investment bank for the whole of the EU, handling billions of transactions every day. So a smooth, orderly transition out of the EU isn't just necessary for the UK, but for the rest of Europe too.
And what about the Trump effect? The US president-elect has threatened to rip up key trade deals, which many say will hurt global growth. A fact publicly acknowledged today by Mark Carney for the first time.
I wonder, Governor, how worried are you about President-elect Trump enacting some of his threats, if you like, around trade, and what impact that could have on financial stability here and across Europe?
There is this possibility that that the slowdown in the growth of world trade, which we have seen over the past few years, accelerates, and accelerates because of discrete policy initiatives, potentially from the world's largest economy.
And adding to the pressure tonight, oil prices have soared by 8% after OPEC agreed a landmark deal to cut output, a move destined to push up inflation and potentially hurt banks like RBS and the financial system even more.
Siobhan Kennedy reporting.
Well, we're joined now by two members of the Treasury Select Committee. With me in the studio is the Labour MP Helen Goodman, and we're joined from Westminster by Conservative MP Jacob Rees-Mogg. Let's turn to you first of all, Jacob Rees-Mogg. How alarmed are you by the fact that RBS, mostly owned by us, the taxpayers, has failed the stress test?
Not unduly. The stress tests were extremely severe. They modelled a downturn in UK GDP of over 4%, a serious decline in China, collapse in UK property prices, and a panic in emerging markets. And what the Bank of England is rightly doing is seeing if banks can survive under these very extreme conditions. And RBS's capital at that point would be, I think, at 5.9%, below the stress test limit. But Bear in mind, in 2008, RBS's capital was down to about 1%, so it's so much better than it was in 2008.
Right, but this version of RBS is a creation of your government, so your government is ultimately responsible.
That's not true.
And the fact that the stress test, that
no,
it has
hold on,
failed
that's
the stress
wrong.
test, the fact that it has failed the stress test is, frankly, appalling, because it means that it is not storm-worthy when we're approaching all these rather choppy waters.
Well, I think you ought to get your facts right to start with, that RBS was actually a creation of the last Labour government and is subject to certain conditionality imposed upon it by the European Union, getting rid of some part of its business.
But you're responsible for it. This government is responsible for it.
Well, I was just correcting your facts. We can discuss opinions once we've settled the facts. The RBS has managed to improve its capital position very markedly. It is quite right that the Bank of England is setting difficult tests, which RBS has come quite close to meeting, but not quite far enough. It has two major outstanding problems. One is a regulatory issue in the United States, where it could face a bill running to over $10 billion, and it has the issue with disposing, as required by the European Union, of a number of its SME customers. And those two issues, combined with a really doomsday scenario of the stress tests, means it falls below. But it is a much, much stronger position than it was in 2008.
Helen Goodman, I mean, the point is that this started under Labour, didn't it? I mean, the massive debt burden from which RBS is still trying to dig itself out from.
Well,
is a legacy of your government.
The taxpayers saved RBS at a cost of 45 billion, and we were hoping that the Chancellor would be able to sell shares in RBS for 20 billion. He can't now do that. That's another reason for the hole in his public finances. And in fact, there's even a further problem for RBS, which is there's a big Financial Conduct Authority report hanging over them because of the way they mistreated small businesses. And, of course, as the Governor said, there's the general problem faced by the whole financial services of what the Brexit deal is going to be.
But what would you have done differently?
Well, I think that it was reasonable to try and make RBS work as a conventional bank, but I think now the government really needs to think about putting all options back on the table and look at whether or not we should be using RBS to make the kind of banks that are locally focused, SME focused, like they have in Germany, and using the assets for that. I'm not saying that's the right solution, but I think something pretty radical is needed, because clearly the taxpayer's not going to get money back just by selling the shares.
OK. Jacob Rees-Mogg, let's turn back to you. I mean, the Governor of the Bank of England was quite clear today, saying that one of the big risk factors, one of the known unknowns facing the world economy is the presidency of Donald Trump. We've got the crisis, potential banking crisis, a massive one in Italy. I mean, these are all very strong headwinds. Again, if our banking system is not up to these challenges, if it has not been prepared for these challenges, we're in a pretty sorry state, aren't we?
Well, fortunately, most of our banks are, and I think the Bank of England deserves some credit for this, as does RBS, to have got itself into a nearly good enough position. It's not quite good enough. You're absolutely right. The Italian banking crisis is enormously serious and threatens the fundamental stability of the euro. There is its referendum on Monday, and the Prime Minister may resign if he loses it. So, yes, there's a lot of instability coming from abroad, and the stress tests are there to look at possible events that may destabilise our banking system. But this is what a prudent system does to ensure robustness. And can I go back to 2008? Because I would like to make clear, I think the Labour Party did the right thing then to rescue RBS, and this is the continuation of actually quite sensible policy to get our banking system back to some degree of normality, to have it properly capitalised and to be able to deal with shocks, which it wasn't able to do before.
OK. Jacob Rees-Mogg, Helen Goodman, we've got to leave it there. Thanks very much. John.
Today's warning from the Governor of the Bank of England carried troubling echoes of the run-up to the last big financial crash. Mark Carney said British households are spiralling into debt at the fastest rate for 11 years, with credit card lending at record levels. And there was more evidence of financial uncertainty when one of the high street banks, RBS, failed the Bank of England's so-called stress test. Our business editor, Joel Hills, is here. Joel, let's remind ourselves, I suppose, first, what is a stress test? And how does it work?
Well, it works because the Bank of England wants our banks to be strong enough to endure the worst. And what they've dreamt up isn't quite an Armageddon scenario, Raggy, but it has certain qualities of end of the world to it. What the scenario stress test is a deep recession, similar to the one we saw back in 2008. It models a a surge in unemployment and a collapse in the value of house prices by 31%. Now, this is pretty extreme stuff, and one bank came up short. Royal Bank of Scotland, the bank the taxpayer owned, it failed. All very embarrassing. It had to raise capital shortfall of £2 billion. But Mark Carney was clear that this is the exception. The general rule is our banks are robust.
But the UK financial system has demonstrated its ability to dampen rather than amplify the impact on the real economy of a series of shocks. Its resilience has been further reinforced by the 2016 stress test, and such resilience may prove valuable given the elevated likelihood that some UK-specific risks to financial stability could materialize.
We talk about the resilience of stress tests, but just how reliable are they?
Well, look, the Bank of England bases its stress tests on what's called the book value of bank assets. And sceptics will tell you, if you look at the stock market value of the various banks, Barclays, Royal Bank of Scotland, Standard Chartered, they're considerably lower than the book value. Put another way, investors don't believe the bank loans are worth what the banks say they are. And critics say the Bank of England should reflect that.
That's worrying on its own right, but Carney also warned about other factors, wider factors, that could affect our economy when he's talking today.
Today we got the assessment, Raggy, of the dangers that may lie ahead. Britain as a nation imports, as you know, far more than it exports. That leaves us vulnerable if foreign investment dries up. On the other side of the world, China's growth looks debt-fueled, potentially dangerous. If a bubble bursts there, we'll be affected. Here at home, consumers are running down their savings and borrowing in a way that they haven't really since the financial crisis. Cause for concern. And I think tonight, Raggy, all eyes at the Bank of England will be on the share price. The OPEC cartel, a cartel of 14 countries that control around a third of total oil production, have decided to rein things in. The oil price immediately leapt, and when the price of oil moves up, the price of everything moves up. Now, this is early days, and OPEC may not have the muscle it thinks it is, but the objective here by the cartel is to push oil prices up. Ouch.
OK, Joel, thank you very much indeed.
I've been getting away with it all my